Corn-fed beef will be used to illustrate how the Institutional Review Board (IRB) criteria of principlism can be practically applied as a regulatory model for food systems, just as principlism is being practically applied as a regulatory model for research on human subjects. A partial solution to some of the most serious problems associated with the industrialization of food production will then be presented as a three-step process that argues that society ought to 1. Implement stricter conflict of interest laws for government regulators. 2. Have Congress mandate that the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the Food Safety Inspection Service, FSIS, adopt the Belmont Report principles that are currently used by the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, for regulating research on human subjects. And 3. Have HHS expand Title 45, Part 46 of the Code of Federal Regulations to include a Subpart F, additional considerations for animal husbandry and agriculture. Who are people more afraid of? A terrorist attack by some religious fanatic or Monsanto? Lacking statistical knowledge and lacking public examples of even who Monsanto is, and being able to identify and come up with multiple instances of dangerous terrorists, the availability heuristic model correctly concludes that most citizens have an excessive fear of a terrorist attack and a lack of fear towards Monsanto, Cargill, and Archer Daniels Midland, ADM. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that generally work well, but they can also lead to systematic errors. The availability heuristic is a propensity to put higher probability of an event occurring on those events in which there is a higher availability of recollection than those in which there are fewer recollections. Because most Americans have higher recollections of terrorist activities than those of food producers, they therefore have a disproportionate fear of terrorists. Outside the food production industry, most people in society don't even know who Monsanto, Cargill, or ADM are. Monsanto is the maker of DDT, PCBs, aspartame, Agent Orange, also known as Roundup, bovine growth hormone, genetically engineered seed. Monsanto is well on its way to owning the majority of the world's seeds, and they are affiliated with the world's largest seed developers and research companies. Together with Cargill, the largest privately held food conglomerate in the world, and ADM, they own and or control the majority of the Western world's agriculture, animal husbandry, and food processing. One approach that can be used to minimize such evaluative errors of threat is through the use of principlism. Principlism is a practical approach for moral analysis and decision-making that is used by institutional review boards, IRBs, for the protection of human research subjects. Principlism as public policy is meant to be compatible with a variety of worldviews. Principlism has already proven its effectiveness in both the biomedical and the behavioral science fields in the protection of human research subjects. The origins of principlistic approach can be traced back to the Belmont Report, a congressional mandate adopted by the Department of Health and Human Services. With principlism, there are 4 principles of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice that are in non-hierarchical order, and each principle is to be specified and balanced with regards to each other in terms of applicability and importance as determined by the situation. This synergistic reflective equilibrium model provides the internal checks and balances that a single principle approach would not have. Principlism, with its multiple principles and its internal complexities, greatly expand its useful range of applicability. Principlism provides a clear and distinct approach for the moral analysis of not only research on human subjects, but also for agriculture, animal husbandry, and industrial food production in general. Historically, philosophy has not been very effective in practically analyzing such topics because traditionally philosophy has been dependent on narrow, incompatible worldviews. Practical solutions must recognize the benefits of diverse pluralistic societies and the need for diverse pluralistic public policy. Principlism is generally recognized as being derivable from, consistent with, or at least not in conflict with the multitude of worldviews as exemplified by theological and spiritual worldviews, scientific and naturalistic worldviews, and social and political worldviews. Principlism addresses a constructive dialogue between worldviews that have the intersubjective moral agreement of the broader moral principles of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. However, the traditional moral justification and processes for making such political and corporate changes seems to be lacking or inadequate, as they are dependent on agents who hold to differing worldviews agreeing on a particular worldview. When such mono-worldview approaches are used, success is usually defined by the dominant group, winning through the progressive use of conflict, violence, and war. Principlism provides a much-needed paradigm or framework for moral analysis and effective implementation of political and corporate changes in food systems within a pluralistic society that hold to many different types of worldviews. Principlism is a federal law for all research on human subjects in which there is any type of direct or indirect federal funding. Every institutional review board, IRB, in the country must comply with the uniform criteria derived from the Belmont Report, here being referred to as Principlism. In response to the Belmont Report, the Department of Health and Human Services revised and expanded its regulations for the protection of human research subjects. The U.S. government defines institutional research as follows: a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, and evaluation, designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Although food systems and the human consumption of its products does not technically meet the above definition of research, it is still not so far removed from being classified as a type of research on human subjects. When you consider the short-term and long-term consequences of genetically modified soybeans, corn, canola, and wheat cross-pollinating with other traditional plants, or that of genetically modified salmon that get loose and breed with other wild salmon, or the health consequences related to the consumption of corn-fed beef and highly processed and refined foods, then food science certainly can be classified as a type of research on human subjects. As research, the industrial food system violates all four principles of principlism. Number one, autonomy. Consumers are not being informed as to the risks and harms of consuming the foods they purchase, and therefore are not providing informed consent, which is a necessary condition for research, a violation of autonomy. 2. Beneficence. Consumers are not getting health benefits from much of the food that they consume, which is a necessary condition for research, a violation of beneficence. 3. Non-maleficence. Consumers are being exposed to significant risk and health burdens, which is not allowed in research, a violation of non-maleficence. 4. Justice. Many consumer groups have little economic choice but to consume the government-subsidized, cheap, empty calories that disproportionately affect the poor, creating unequal distribution of subject burdens, a violation of justice. Food production is under no uncertain terms not only research on human subjects, but also research on the entire biota and the environment. It is one thing for food production to negatively affect a current generation in which the harm was generated, but it is quite an entirely different matter when food systems negatively affect all future generations that had no part in the generation of the harm. Since food production has utterly failed in its ability to self-regulate, the government, whose prime directive is to protect individual rights and liberties in society, must compensate for that failure and regulate food production. However, the government has also failed to effectively regulate food production because corporate America, such as Monsanto, Cargill, and ADM, also have enormous economic interests and influence over government regulations. As a result, the FDA, EPA, and the Food Safety Inspection Service are being directed by individuals that have significant conflicts of interest, in that they either work for or are getting benefits from Monsanto, Cargill, and ADM, the very industrialized food producers that need to be regulated. The industrial food production giants, with their economic interests and lack of moral insight, and the Department of Health and Human Services, FDA, EPA, and Food Safety Inspection Services, with their lack of being effective protective regulatory agencies, are unjustly exposing the public, biota, and the environment to significant risk and harms without the public's consent. This is very similar to what happened with the for-profit private pharmaceutical industry distribution of thalidomide, one of the biggest medical tragedies of modern times, which resulted in severe birth defects affecting up to 10,000 to 20,000 people, and government human research Tuskegee syphilis study arguably the most infamous biomedical research study in U.S. history, in which 399 impoverished black men were not informed that they had syphilis and were denied treatment when treatment was available. Those who were involved in the private distribution of drugs and those who were doing government research totally failed in the proper use of any reasonable moral reflectivity. Once exposed, the public outrage resulted in a congressional mandate that resulted in the Belmont Report, Principlism. Health and Human Services then adopted the moral principles of the Belmont Report and mandated that every institution that received any direct or indirect federal funding and performed any research on human subjects had to comply with the Belmont Report's principles. IRBs were then created in each institution in order to protect individuals who were research subjects. Government regulation, with the threat of loss of federal funding, became necessary in order to prevent the most outrageous forms of moral disregard. A credible threat of significant economic loss for noncompliance to reasonable moral reflectivity must also be made against food producers. An independent review board for moral analysis of food production activities using principlism needs to be implemented and enforced for the protection of food consumers, for those who are being consumed, and for the environment. Anthropocentric argument. If the IRB criteria of principlism were to be expanded to include agriculture and animal science, then not only would the treatment and welfare of human beings be improved, but the treatment and welfare of other species would also be indirectly improved. It can be argued that the indirect improvement of the treatment of other species is immoral as it is too anthropocentric, human-centered, and that the improvement of the treatment of other species needs to be directly implemented by the recognition of their intrinsic worth from a biocentric or life-centered point of view. However, the reality of the matter is that our current society is not very receptive to biocentric, life-centered, or naturalistic, scientific holism standards. Most Western people are anthropocentric, a point of view that has been perpetuated by theocentric, God-centered religious perspectives. Many people's theocentric worldviews are modified anthropocentric worldviews where God is anthropomorphized by attributing him with both the image and attributes of man. In such a social context, the most effective arguments for benefit of animals are arguments that show that the conditions that make these animals suffer also results in unacceptable human harm and or human suffering. For example, feedlot cattle in both the beef and dairy industries results in cattle consuming very little grass and a tremendous amount of corn, which their digestive rumen is not designed to digest. This corn diet results in acidification of the rumen. The E. coli, which naturally exists in the colon of grass-fed cattle, is usually destroyed by the acid in the human stomach, making the E. coli harmless. However, corn in the cattle's feed results in acidification of the rumen, which normally has a pH between 6.0 and 6.2. This acidification of the rumen, caused by the high-starch corn diet, results in the natural selection of acid-resistant strain E. coli 015787 that no one had seen before 1980. Now it is found in more than 40% of feedlot cattle, and ingesting as few as 10 of these microbes can cause a fatal infection to a human. E. coli 015787 produces toxins that can destroy the human kidneys, and no treatment is currently available for this type of food poisoning. If an infected person were to unfortunately be given antibiotics, then the antibiotics would kill the E. coli microbes, but the resulting flood of toxins from the dead microbes could also destroy the kidneys in the patient as well. In addition, the rumen is also not designed for the acidic environment created by the eating of corn instead of grass, and as a result, the cattle develop painful ulcers and infections, resulting in the need for cattle to be treated with high doses of antibiotics, or else they will slowly die, and in the case of dairy cattle, they would have an unacceptable amount of pus in the milk. This very high use of both preventative and therapeutic antibiotics for corn-fed beef is also the cause of the natural selection of strains of antibiotic resistance bacteria that also puts humans at significant health risks when consumed. Therefore, the unnecessary and real risk of E. coli 015787, the pus-filled antibiotic-laden milk, and the cheese products, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, the toxic runoff from fertilizers used to grow the corn the cattle eat, in which nitrates convert to nitrites, which binds to hemoglobin, compromising the blood's ability to carry oxygen to the brain, some of the ammonium nitrate evaporates and is transformed into nitrous oxide, an important greenhouse gas that contributes to global warming, and some of the fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides seep down, contaminating the water table. The genetically modified corn and agriculture contamination that is spreading around the globe by pollution, and the contaminated animal sewage that is filled with heavy metals, chemicals, hormones, and other pharmaceuticals make the manure too toxic to be used even as fertilizers, which inadvertently end up in waterways where downstream scientists have found fish and amphibians existing abnormal sex characteristics. The nitrogen tides in the ocean that stimulate the excessive growth of algae, creating a hypoxic dead zone, and the list of negative harmful effects to humans goes on, making it impossible to come to any other conclusion using the criteria of principlism that such practices are anything but immoral, wrong, and not to be made illegal. The function of law is to prevent and protect citizens from such unnecessary human harms that affect not only the current generation, but all future generations as well. Concentrated animal feed operations, or CAFOs, is one such unnecessary harmful activity that is usually done in order to maximize dairy production or to quickly fatten up the cattle during the last 6 to 8 months before slaughter. For beef cattle, because of the high proportion of corn that is being fed to them, 180 days is about the maximum amount of time that the toxic diet can be tolerated by the cattle before their abscessed livers are blown out. What makes this practice of grain-fed cattle even more outrageous is the fact that economically the increased cost per cattle, if they were to be only grass-fed, would only be around $25 more per head. Grass-fed beef is much more healthy in that it is leaner, has 3 times more omega-3 fatty acids, and for many people tastes better too. Scientific research now indicates that many of the health-related problems associated with eating red meat is really a problem of eating corn-fed beef. Just as ruminants are ill-adapted to eating corn, so also humans are ill-adapted to eating ruminants that eat corn. If the true costs of grain-fed beef were to be included, all the externalized costs to the consumers and environment, grain-fed beef would be prohibitively expensive. Principlism evaluation. 1. Autonomy. Since humans are being exposed to significant risks and burdensome consequences because of the consumption of corn-fed beef and dairy products, and because most human consumers are A. being manipulated by culture and advertising, B. not being provided with full disclosure of what they are consuming, along with C. their inability to evaluate and act on scientific evidence of what good, wholesome food choices are, it follows that most human consumers have not given an informed consent to the eating of corn-fed beef and dairy products. Therefore, the feeding of corn to cattle is a violation of human autonomy. 2. Beneficence. Since it is more beneficial for humans to consume grass-fed beef and dairy products rather than corn-fed beef and dairy products, it follows that the feeding of corn to cattle is a violation of beneficence. 3. Non-maleficence. Since it is risky and harmful for humans to consume corn-fed beef and dairy products as compared to grass-fed beef and dairy products, the feeding of corn to cattle is a violation of non-maleficence. 4. Justice. Since the human consumption of meat and dairy products from corn-fed cattle is currently cheaper than grass-fed cattle, this has resulted in the unequal distribution of benefits and burdens across economic and educational classes. Corn-fed cattle products are more burdensome for the poor and uneducated than those who are more wealthy and educated because grass-fed cattle products are prohibitively expensive for the poor, and information as to the benefits and burdens of food choices are more difficult to acquire and understand for the uneducated than the educated. Therefore, the feeding of corn to cattle is a violation of justice. This anthropocentric argument that shows that it is a violation of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice feed cattle a high-starch diet of corn is an effective argument for religious societies in which arguments for animal rights and animal welfare based on the pain and suffering of sentient beings has little to no effect on their food consumption. Biocentric argument. Animal welfare and rights arguments for the biocentric minority in society would be that sentient beings avoid pain and suffering as much as possible, and therefore it is not in their interest and preference to be subjected to pain and suffering. Therefore, it is morally wrong for human beings to unnecessarily inflict pain and suffering on any sentient being and to unnecessarily treat any subject of a life solely as a means to an end, all of which is currently being done with regards to our meat and dairy production. From a biocentric point of view, the feeding of corn to cattle results in acidification of the rumen, which results in painful ulcers, diarrhea, bloat, ruminitis, liver disease, and a general weakening of the immune system that leaves the animals vulnerable to feedlot diseases such as pneumonia, enterotoxemia, etc. The high-starch corn diet would eventually kill the cattle, because over time the acids eat away at the rumen wall, allowing the bacteria to enter into the animal's bloodstream. These microbes wind up in the liver, where they form abscesses and impair the liver's function. To keep the cattle alive long enough for slaughter at the CAFOs, which is about 180 days, the cattle are given prodigious amounts of antacids and antibiotics. In fact, most of the antibiotics sold in America today go into animal feed, causing the natural selection of antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria. From this biocentric point of view, the feeding of corn to cattle is biologically unnatural and causes a sentient being to experience unacceptable amounts of pain and suffering. Principlism evaluation from a biocentric point of view. 1. Autonomy. Cattle are herbivores and have one of the most evolved digestive systems of all living beings. However, the rumens are not adapted for high-starch diets and animal flesh products. It follows that cattle have not and would not choose to eat high-starch corn, meat, fat, blood, and the arsenal of pharmaceutical drugs that are necessary because of such a diet. It also follows that since cattle are sentient beings, they would never choose to be exposed to the pain and suffering that is associated with such diets and CAFOs living arrangements. Therefore, the feeding of high-starch diets such as corn to cattle is a violation of animal autonomy. 2. Beneficence. Since there's no personal benefit for cattle to be eating corn, meat, fat, blood, and the necessary arsenal of pharmaceutical drugs because of such a diet, and since being kept in a CAFO is also not in the cattle's best interest, and with regards to comfort and communicable diseases, it follows that the feeding of high-starch diets such as corn to cattle is a violation of beneficence. 3. Non-maleficence. Since being kept in a CAFO and being fed a high-starch diet of corn, meat, fat, blood, and the arsenal of pharmaceutical drugs that are necessary because of such a diet is harmful to the cattle and results in communicable diseases and unnecessary pain and suffering, it follows that the feeding of corn to cattle is a violation of non-maleficence. 4. Justice. Since living in a CAFO, concentrated animal feed operation, and being fed the high-starch diet of corn, meat, fat, blood, and the arsenal of pharmaceutical drugs that are necessary because of such a diet is unnatural and particularly burdensome for cattle, it follows that there is an unfair distribution of benefits and burdens. Therefore, the feeding of corn to cattle is a violation of justice. This biocentric argument that shows that it is a violation of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice to feed cattle a high-starch diet of corn is an effective argument for those who have worldviews that are more biocentric and holistic. Human rights and animal rights. If Health and Human Services, FDA, EPA, and Food Safety Inspection Services were to subject agriculture and animal science to the criteria of principlism, then the feeding of corn to cattle would have to be both a human rights violation and an animal rights violation. Humans have a positive right to the accessibility of good, wholesome food and a negative right of not being deceived into thinking that unwholesome foods are wholesome. Domesticated animals that are dependent on humans for sustenance have a positive right to be fed good, wholesome food as determined by their biological species, and a negative right of not having their natural diets and habits unnecessarily interfered with when the burdens outweigh the benefits for the animal. The anthropocentric, biocentric, and holistic worldviews all conclude that the feeding of corn to cattle violates all four principles of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. It is also the case that human rights and animal rights, both positive and negative, are being violated by the feeding of corn to cattle. Therefore, the only logical conclusion for any rational human being, regardless of worldviews or perspectives, is that the feeding of high-starch diets such as corn to cattle is immoral and wrong and ought to be prohibited. Heuristic biases. The availability heuristic is the propensity to put higher probability of an event occurring on those events in which there is a higher availability of recollection than those in which there are fewer recollections. Oftentimes this intuition works well, other times it doesn't work so well, as exemplified by people being more afraid of a terrorist attack than Monsanto. Industrial food producers stay as invisible as possible, as the less people know about them and what they do, the less they will object and the less they will be fearful. For example, when all the different name brand beef products at the supermarket, who would have thought that in this country Tyson's subsidiary IBP, Cargill's subsidiary XL, Swift & Company, and National slaughter and market 4 out of 5 beef? Most consumers haven't even heard of IBP, XL, Swift & Company, or National. This, of course, is intentional. If consumers don't know who produces the products they consume, then there can be no distrust, fear, or blame attributed to them. Another heuristic bias is called adjustment anchoring, where people are psychologically biased towards the probability of the initial starting point. For example, in complex systems where there are multiple components that all have a low probability of failure, the complex system as a whole can in fact have a very high rate of failure. However, the intuitive heuristic error of adjustment anchoring is that people will have a tendency to underestimate the probabilities of failure in such a complex system. Food production and the human body are such complex systems, and when people ingest multiple low-risk products, people intuitively conclude that the health risk is low, when in reality the health risk is very high. Consumption of such products can result in numerous kinds of system failures, such as cancers, heart disease, and Alzheimer's, just to name a few. Unfortunately, food producers and the regulators take economic advantage of the psychological propensity for consumers to use the heuristic bias of adjustment anchoring with the products that they are consuming. It is not unusual for industrialized food products to have multiple low-risk ingredients in a single product, so that when the individual eats the product, or multiple products, the risk becomes compounded and the products can become dangerously unhealthy. Corporations in the food industry are capitalizing on these naturally occurring intuitive heuristic biases by becoming intimately involved in the creation and implementation of public policies. These public policies promote the interests of industrialized food production at the expense of both the consumer and those who are being consumed. Principlism, evaluation of heuristic errors. Number 1, autonomy. Consumers are not being informed as to who is producing what, how they're being produced, and what the total risk is when consuming food products. Consumers, because of availability and adjustment anchoring heuristics, are therefore not providing informed consent, a violation of autonomy. 2, beneficence. Corporations are economically benefiting from consumers not by being autonomous. Corporate food producers have very little regard towards producing good, wholesome food to consumers. Therefore, corporations are not at all concerned for the best interests of the consumer and are capitalizing on availability and adjustment anchoring heuristics, a violation of beneficence. 3, non-maleficence. Consumers are being exposed to significant risk and health burdens by the food they are consuming. Corporations are lacing food products with all types of toxic chemicals, capitalizing on availability and adjustment anchoring heuristic, a violation of non-maleficence. Justice. Consumers have very few options other than consuming that which the corporate giants provide them. This monopolistic imbalance of necessary basic needs is unacceptable in a democratic society and is accomplished by capitalizing on availability and adjustment anchoring heuristic, a violation of justice. Conflict of interest. One of the main responsibilities of the EPA, FDA, and Food Safety Inspection Service is to effectively regulate harmful substances for human and animal consumption. In order for this to occur, it is recognized that conflict of interest must be minimized as much as possible. However, it is oftentimes the case that the government policy that is meant to regulate a particular corporation is developed by that very corporation itself. This, of course, is a conflict of interest. EPA. The EPA is charged with the responsibility to protect human health and the environment by writing and enforcing regulations based on laws passed by Congress. The EPA employs 17,000 people, has 10 regional offices, and 27 laboratories. The main problem with the EPA is that the White House has direct control over the EPA, and its enforcements are subject to whoever is in power. Republicans and Democrats differ in their approaches and concerns towards the environment. In April of 2008, the Union of Concerned Scientists said that more than half of the 1,600 EPA staff scientists reported that they had experienced political interference in their work. The highest number of complaints came from scientists who were involved in the determination of the risk of cancer by chemicals used in food and other aspects of everyday life. Part of the problem comes from the White House Linda Fisher, for example, who was the appointed EPA Deputy Administrator from 2000 to 2003, was also Vice President of Government and Public Affairs for Monsanto from 1995 to 2000, one of the very companies the EPA needs to regulate, creating a serious conflict of interest. FDA. The FDA is no better. Margaret Miller was a chemical lab supervisor for Monsanto from 1985 to 1989. She then became the FDA branch chief in 1989. When clinical trials showed that cows were getting mastitis, pus in the milk, caused by dairy cattle consuming a high-starch diet of corn and developing ulcers and infections, she changed the antibiotic protocol and increased the amounts of permissible antibiotic residues in milk by 100 times. As a result, when the Consumer Union tested milk in New York metropolitan area, they found the presence of 52 different antibiotics in the milk samples. The Wall Street Journal did their own test and confirmed those results. Monsanto executives are being appointed to leadership positions for the EPA and FDA without it being considered a conflict of interest. Michael Taylor was a King and Spalding lawyer from 1984 to 1991, and their primary client was Monsanto. He became the FDA Deputy Commissioner for Policy from 1991 to 1994 and oversaw the FDA's decision not to label genetically modified foods. After his FDA stint, he then went back to Monsanto as Vice President for Public Policy from 1998 to 2000. One last example of many possible examples of conflict of interest is Philip Cooney, the former Chief of Staff for the Bush White House Council on Environmental Quality and former lobbyist for the American Petroleum Institute. A June 2005 memo revealed that Cooney had personally edited documents summarizing the government research on climate change before their release. Cooney resigned 2 days after the memo was published in the New York Times, and then 1 week later he took a job at ExxonMobil in their public affairs department. Principlistic evaluation of conflict of interest. 1. Autonomy. Democracies are based on the Jeffersonian principle of informed electorate. Instead, consumers are being kept uninformed for the economic gains of corporations. Corporations have successfully infiltrated government policy process in order to keep public as uninformed as possible, a violation of autonomy. 2. Beneficence. Government is meant to represent the best interests of its citizenry. Instead, the government is representing the best interests of corporations at the expense of consumers, a violation of beneficence. 3. Non-maleficence. Government is meant to protect its citizens from unwanted risk and harm such as those presented by food producers. Corporations are lacing food products with all types of toxic chemicals just so that they can maximize profits, a violation of non-maleficence. 4. Justice. Government has created a legislative environment in which corporations have a monopolistic influence on public policy. As a result, consumers have very few options other than consuming that which the corporate giants provide them. This monopolistic imbalance of necessary basic needs is unacceptable in a democracy, a violation of justice. The Department of Health and Human Services, EPA, FDA, Food Safety Inspection Services has failed the American public in not paying close attention to conflicts of interest. Not only has the government increased profits for corporations at the expense of the consuming public, animals, agriculture, and ecosystem, but it's also failed to keep itself independent of legitimate conflicts of interest. As a result, the government has failed to determine just what is safe, both with regards to consumable products and with regards to agricultural chemicals or environmental contaminants. What is necessary if government regulation is to work is the legislation of much stricter conflict of interest laws. Government protective agencies must not be unduly influenced by corporate and political influence, and the government must promote the principles of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Society needs to expand the application of principlism that is currently used by the Health and Human Services to protect human research subjects to include more disciplines, other species, agriculture, and the ecosystem as a whole. One logical way that has historical precedence would be for the Department of Health and Human Services to expand the legal scope of Title 45, Part 46, Protection of Human Subjects, to include a Subpart F, Additional Considerations for Animal Husbandry and Agriculture. Subpart A is the basic health and human service policy for the protection of human research subjects that established the IRB and the principlistic approach. The addition of Subpart F would significantly add to the protection of not only human subjects, but it would also protect non-human sentient beings and indirectly plants and the environment as well. This added subpart would also be consistent with the other added subparts, as Subpart B, C, and D already represent other vulnerable groups and those that are unable to represent themselves, i.e. pregnant women, fetuses, neonates, prisoners, and children. The added Subpart F proposed here would then add the vulnerable group of non-human sentient beings, who also cannot represent themselves as an entity per se. If Subpart F were to be adopted, then Part 46 would probably also have to change its current title of Protection of Human Subjects to a more inclusive title, such as Protection of Research Subjects. In conclusion, it has now become necessary to regulate and protect human animals and agriculture from what is currently the most significant threat towards society, industrial food production. Although there isn't a single solution to the fact that the industrial food production industry has failed in its ability to self-regulate and to be regulated, the following would start that restorative process. 1. Implement stricter conflict of interest laws for government regulators. 2. Have Congress mandate that the Food and Drug Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Food Safety and Inspection Service adopt the Belmont Report principles that are currently used by the Department of Health and Human Services for the regulating research on human subjects. And 3. Have Health and Human Services expand Title 45, Part 46 of the Code of Federal Regulations to include a Subpart F, additional consideration for animal husbandry and agriculture. It is well past the time for society to extend the implementation of principlism to all areas of food production. Effective regulation, such as the prohibiting of feeding of corn to cattle, would result in not only a more fair, equal, and just society, but a safer society as well.